All right, welcome again, everyone. We are excited to welcome you into our next session of the Parent Empowerment Conference. And tonight we're welcoming Zosia Zaks. Zosia has more than 20 years of experience supporting hundreds of teenagers and adults on the autism spectrum and with related conditions to live and work in their communities. From 2013 to 2022, he was the manager of programs and education at the Hussman Center for Autistic Adults at Towson University, where he also built an on-campus work readiness program, developed a support program for autistic students, and taught disability social justice courses designed to break down barriers, challenge stereotypes, and build a more inclusive society. He now consults and teaches as Rowan University's first neurodiversity scholar in residence, and he has extensive experience facilitating integration of neurodivergent individuals at work sites and in schools, and speaks nationally on autism and neurodiversity related issues. He brings unique perspectives to professional projects and trainings as a disability counselor, an autistic self-advocate, and a parent of 2 neurodivergent children. So Zosia, I'm going to turn it over to you, and we are so excited that you're here with us tonight, and you should be able to go ahead and share your screen when you're ready.
Okay, hi everybody. We're going to get started in just a minute. I thank you for your patience. There were a couple of technical issues. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can share my PowerPoint here. Just make sure that gets up okay. Can everybody see that? Okay, so I never like to just, stand here and read slides, because that gets a little boring. So I encourage you to interact, ask questions. I might ask you questions. Also, typically, if we're in person, I like to give people a minute to just get settled, take a deep breath, and refocus. I know that's a little hard to do those kinds of practices on Zoom, but if you want to just take a moment and get yourself here, I know I had to take a few deep breaths too. My internet wasn't working, and then Zoom had to reload. It was a whole to do, but I'm here now. So what I'd like to do before I even start the content is I always describe myself for people who have vision impairments. So I'm a white gentleman with brown short hair. I'm wearing brownish glasses and a white button-down shirt. I have a little bit of a beard, and that helps people who have vision impairments to get a sense of what I look like and who's speaking to them. And then I also do something that comes out of feminist standpoint theory, which is I tell people a little bit about my life and who I am, because that indicates where my lived experience is and also where some of my limitations are. There's some things that I can definitely speak to, and then there's some things I really don't have any experience with. So I am, like I said, I'm a white middle-class guy, and I am transgender, and I'm also autistic. I'm the parent of 2 neurodivergent children. I'm also an autism professional. So that gives you a sense of all the different angles at which I'm tackling this. And I have worked with neurodivergent teenagers and adults, like Marcy was saying, for about 20 years, a little more actually, as well as thousands of, generally speaking, young adults who may not be neurodivergent, but young adults, they're all learning and they're all going through a unique developmental phase. And I have done some research with Dr. Strang at Children's Hospital. He's a great resource for everybody in this area. We're very lucky that his program is there. So he's supporting gender diverse, neurodiverse adolescents, and we're researching what would be best practices. Okay, so I'm going to jump right in, but do stop me periodically if you have questions. I also like to just find out from the audience before I jump in. Do you have any specific questions for me tonight, or are there things on your mind that you want me to address? And if the organizers can help me, because due to the slides being up, I may not be able to see everybody, and or if the chat is easier for you or more private, because I know this could be a sensitive topic for people, either now or throughout the evening. Feel free to chat somebody and they can voice your question for you, if that's easier. Do you see any comments or questions at the moment? No? Okay. All right. So I gave you a little bit of background about me. I grew up in the 70s. It was very, very different back then. Some of you of a certain age remember. People were telling my parents, teachers were saying to my parents, we think Zosia's autistic, because I would kind of sit under a table and stare at the fish tank all day. And I was in a Montessori school, so I like to line up those colored rods over and over again. And my mother basically was like, that's impossible, Zosia talks. So, our ideas about autism were very different back then. Also, the transgender world was different. There was not this kind of visibility, cultural conversations, sometimes bad cultural conversations. But back then there were no conversations. We didn't even have the word transgender. The word they used back then it was transsexual. And there were incredible barriers to transitioning. So a lot of us knew that we were gender divergent, but we didn't have access to any sort of care or assistance. The assistance that was out there was very, very, very limited. For example, in my early 20s, I went to a clinic to try to get some help. They said, first of all, you can't transition until you're 26. That was true. That was the law back then. And then they were like, in order to receive any care at all, like such as hormones, you have to live in your chosen gender 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Well, how do I do that? That can also be a safety issue for a lot of people. All right. So if I'm trying to navigate in male spaces, with no facial hair, female voice, etc., it could be kind of not the safest thing in the world. So that was a problem. And then they were like, if you do get approved, it's extremely expensive. There's only a few doctors in the United States who are doing this, and everything would be private pay, and it's thousands and thousands of dollars. So we did the best that we could, but I think that that's why you're seeing so many people transition today. It's not that there's oodles more people. It's just all this backlog from 2008 when the laws got looser. Anyway, so that's just a little bit about me. So, okay, a little bit about transitioning, just some basics. Again, it's hard for me to gauge where the audience is at, if you know all of this or this is brand new. So if I go a little too fast and you want me to slow down, let me know. If you're like, Zaks, we know all of this already, let me know. I'll skip ahead to some of the, what I want to get to is where the autism and gender diversity intersect. But I just wanted to go over a few basic terms here. So when we're talking about gender is like behavior, and it's part of your identity. I'm sorry, hold on a second. I want to change my view here. So give me 1 second. Slideshow. Current slide. Okay, because this bar from Zoom is blocking me. Okay, so it gets a little confusing, but if you hear people say MTF, that means the person was assigned male at birth, but now they're female or they're a woman, and FTM is the other direction. Okay, so they were assigned female at birth, but now the T is for transitioning to male or masculine. Okay, a trans masc person identifies as male or masculine, but not necessarily a man. Okay, so on sort of a trans masculine spectrum, all right, they may identify as male, but they may, for example, not be interested in doing hormones, or they may just feel like, I'm not exactly a man as we define it in society. Trans femme is the reverse. They identify as female, they want to use she, her pronouns, but they don't necessarily see themselves as a woman. Non-binary, they don't identify as male or female. Gender fluid, the person goes back and forth between two or more gender identities. Gender queer, they're just a mix of identities, or they're exploring. Transsexual is that old term. And if you say it among young people, they get very upset. And they're like, that's, a medicalized term. Don't use that. That's offensive. But for those of us of a certain age, we don't have those negative associations. That's who we were. So it's not, to us, it's not a problem. But I guess young people have decided that's, we don't use that anymore. We say transgender or gender divergent. Okay, so there's this whole alphabet soup of identities. Let's see if we can get the slides to move. I'm telling you, tonight is something. There we go. Okay, sexual orientation is totally different. Okay, so if you're cisgender, that means you were assigned male at birth, you feel like a man, it's all aligned. Cis is Latin for sane. Okay, if you're gender divergent, like I just said, you have this plethora of options. You don't really fit the sex you were assigned at birth. Okay, but you can be any sexual orientation, including asexual. So I just always want to make that clear at the outset that those are two different things. Okay, so you could be cisgender and you could be gay. All right, so there are non-gender divergent people who are in the LGBTQ world. Everyone still with me? I know it's a huge alphabet soup. Okay. So transitioning, like I said, nowadays, there's like this wonderful floodgate of options. You can medically transition. That's typically hormones, surgeries. There's a lot of pros and cons. You can just socially transition. That's where you may change your pronouns or your appearance, but you even may not. Okay. I met a young person who identifies as transmasculine moving towards transgender, but they are a vocal artist. So right now they don't want to take hormones. All right. So if you looked at them, you might jump to the conclusion that that's a female person, but they're not. All right. So there's the social aspect of transitioning, and then there's medical transition. And sometimes people do one or the other or both. Okay. I mentioned a while ago that there were laws about this. Okay. They used to be called the Harry Benjamin laws after a doctor at Johns Hopkins, because Johns Hopkins was really where the only place in the United States where people were getting care and surgeries in the 60s, 70s into the, well, they shut the program down for a variety of reasons. So I'm not going to go into it right now. But anyway, the laws, like I said, were extremely strict. Okay. So you had to be a certain age. You had to live 24/7 for a whole year first. You had to go through intensive psychological and psychiatric gatekeeping, right? So, and it, like I said, even if you got through all the gates, insurance didn't touch it. So, yeah, you know, this is thousands and thousands of dollars for hormones. You know, a surgery could be $70,000, right? So most people, that was just like not going to happen. So they changed it to the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, or WPATH. And if you're a professional, that's important to know. You know, they provide trainings, they have conferences, they have good information, and they also now set the regulations. So it's still regulated, but they listen to the voices of gender divergent people, and they loosened things up in 2008. And basically now what they did is in the prior to 2008, gender identity disorder was like a medical diagnosis, but to give the idea that gender identity is a natural function of human beings that you don't necessarily have to do anything about, they took out gender identity disorder and they created gender dysphoria. So gender dysphoria is because you could have a gender identity that's gender divergent and decide not to do anything further because you're okay with yourself and you don't mind moving around society as you are. Gender dysphoria is when that persistent inconsistency is bothering you so much and is causing so much anxiety that that's when you need like the hormones and the surgery. So that was a big change. So I'm just updating everybody as to where we're at right now. Okay, so we don't think of gender identity as a disorder anymore. There's just variation among human beings. If you're so dysphoric because you're walking around in a body that like doesn't feel right, that's when, you know, you might need help. All right, but even then you have a lot of options, and it's much more self-directed process now. There's a big debate though, as I'm sure anyone who has listened to the news. Okay, what age should people be allowed to medically transition? How do schools deal with someone who's socially transitioned? What bathroom do they use? At what point does a transitioning person have to switch sports teams? Okay, and okay, we also have people whose gender identity is not obvious, and we don't want to disrespect them, but frankly, sometimes it's just hard to tell. So how do we navigate that? Right, so that's why people are putting their pronouns up to sort of role model and be an ally and be like, hey, you know, you're safe with me, you can disclose how you want to identify and I'll respect you. All right, so now we're getting to where the autism and the gender diversity intersect. So by the numbers, they've been doing studies. The studies are getting better and better. Basically, there was a couple of things that they could do. They could go to transgender clinics and count how many people are autistic, or they can go to autistic clinics and count how many people are transgender. All right, so these are the latest numbers that we got. About 0.5% of the general population in the world identifies as gender diverse. So it's pretty rare. About 1% of the world is autistic. Okay. Now, among autistic people, about 7 to 9% will be gender diverse. So that's a lot more than the general population. Okay. So that's why self-advocates have been pushing that, even if it makes people uncomfortable, we have to have these conversations. Because gender diverse people are already vulnerable, and then you throw the autism in there, and you're talking about kind of a double vulnerability and a real need for support around this. Okay, so all right, this gets into more and more data. If you love data, you can look up these studies. Okay, like I said, that's how we're counting. We either go to the autism clinics, how many are gender diverse, we go to gender clinics, how many are neurodiverse or autistic. All right, there's other studies. So studies are still coming in. What I wanted people to know is that it's not like a new thing. There are case studies from the 1970s, okay, where autistic individuals, as well as individuals with what used to be called mental retardation, but now we call it intellectual disability, and they had the full range of alternative sexual identities and gender non-conforming behavior. So this didn't like drop out of the sky. All right. In other words, disabled people can be gay or transgender too, right? And that's just like non-disabled people, right? Full range of humanity here. All right, the question is, so why? Why are we seeing that huge number, 7 to 8%? When in the general world, it's more like 0.5 to 1%. There's different theories, all right? And you can look in the scholarship. I include all, for those of you who like the academic articles or need it for your professional development, they're in there. So one possibility is what they call the extreme male brain theory. It was proposed by Cohen in the 1990s, although frankly, if you look at Dr. Asperger's original works from the 1940s, he suggests this also. So the idea proposed here is that autism is a condition of extreme maleness, that there's differences between male and female brains. And so autistic brains are more male-ish, okay? And then they throw in that there's a few studies that suggest exposure to testosterone. You know, that's their idea of how autistic brains would come out more male. Okay, so you see them saying things like, well, autistic individuals regarded of their reported sex on average were more masculinized, right? The big hole in this, among many holes, is that there's plenty of autistic individuals who are androgynous or feminine. It's very cultural to say what's male or female, right? So who says that male brains are systematizing? You know, there may be natal differences, but we're cultural beings, and so we act on everything. And we know that maleness and femaleness is different all over the world. So that's a little skeptical. Yeah, so that's what they're talking about here. It's really coming out of like cultural ideas, right? It also doesn't explain, there are plenty of autistics who were assigned male at birth that transitioned to female. So how would this theory explain it? It doesn't. All right, the other possibility is that maybe it's just a special interest. Everybody knows what special interests are in autism. Are you seeing a lot of people nod? Anyone want me to go into that?
Yeah, can you explain it a little bit more, Zosia?
Sure. So a feature of autism, they used to call it like hyperfocus or preoccupations or obsessions. That's kind of a little judgmental. So now we say special interests, and that's where you'll see an autistic person and they may know every single thing about trains, when they were made, the different companies, how trains are manufactured, and then how do they get to the different cities, and what are the different train schedules. And they really love it, and they love talking about it. And we're trying not to pathologize special interests anymore. I mean, frankly, they may need to learn, just like all of us. You know, you don't talk in the middle of math class, it's rude to the teacher, but they're allowed to have their interests. And in fact, for many autistic people, they derive great meaning, and they can even have careers based on it. for some people who are perhaps less verbal or have, intellectual disability, you may not see so much of, that kind of focus on a topic or area of expertise, but they may have certain behaviors that they like to do. Okay. Or they may always wear red. Okay. And, God forbid there's purple socks in the laundry, because that's just not okay. Right. So, but we're trying not to pathologize that, because frankly, this is really human traits, because I'll look at non-autistic people. I went to Washington one spring for a conference, and I guess the local hockey team was winning a championship or something. And there's people walking around, and they had like Nationals cupcakes, national socks, national flags on their car, national seasons tickets. I mean, the whole 9 yards. So why does yours get to be a hobby and mine has to be this pathology, So we're trying to really destigmatize it. But so when it comes to gender diversity, a few people said, well, maybe autistic people really aren't gender divergent. They just pick gender diversity as one of those autistic obsession topics. And that's why they're talking about it. Well, the problem with that is that when you talk to autistic people who are gender divergent, you can tell that they really are gender divergent, and it's extremely stressful to have your identity and your need for support completely dismissed, which would not happen to a non-autistic person. So this really comes out of discrimination and stigma more than an authentic theory. So that doesn't work. Possible theory 3, maybe it's just delayed. Like you see in a lot of literature, especially around intellectual disability too, that maybe autistic people are just naive. They don't really know how to fit in. They're, confused about what a man is, but once they figure it out, they'll be okay. Well, that's just ableism. Even people who have intellectual disability, like they know who they are. They know when they're uncomfortable. They know when they're upset. They know when something's wrong. They know when they need help. So let's not go there. I've been talking about this theory for a long time, and suddenly now I'm starting to see it come out in the literature. We know autism is not necessarily a lack of the sociality that's unique to human beings. I think all human beings, we want to love and we want to connect, but autistic people, maybe they do it differently because of those, if you think about sensory differences, where you go back to special interests for a moment, and so how autistic people focus and what they like to focus on. And so, our society has very narrow ideas, and so it can make socializing very difficult. Okay, but it's not an innate lack of humanness. Right. At the same time, another difference among humans among autistic people that we notice is that autistic people tend to learn differently. Okay, so when we learn social things, it's the same as if, we had to learn how to play the piano or learn French. Right. So I gave an example when I talked over the weekend at the Autism Summit in person. And if we had had more time, I would have made people role play. And I can't really make you role play here on Zoom. It's a little complicated. But I had them, reflect on the last time they were at work. And I said, did you talk to the UPS delivery person the same way you would talk to the CEO? What do you all think? Anyone want to share their thoughts on that?
I would say probably not. People tend to kind of perceive people in authority a different type of respect.
Okay. And the UPS guy, it's more like, hey, you got my package? Yeah, thanks. Hey, I hope the Ravens win this weekend, right? Sound familiar? Okay. How did you learn how to do that?
I'm gonna say most people probably by imitation, what they've seen around them and how they saw the adults in their lives.
Yeah, just kind of like from living. Yeah, osmosis. Autistic people don't learn that way. Every social moment is completely unique. So we have to learn everything, right? So if you're thinking of it that way, so we're learning socially, we're learning everything. We have to really sit down and think about it consciously, or get lessons or someone breaks it down for us. That's why some of those visual strategies work so well with autistic children, because okay, then we can see what people are doing and what's going on. So it's gender is a social construct. It's a way of social organization, actually, if you think about it. And so in a way, since we're not getting it, unless you explicitly teach it to us, we kind of have an accidental freedom. And I think that that's why, the numbers are there. And I think that maybe my hypothesis is that, our, like I said, our society tends to be more narrow than many societies. And, if you don't conform, that can be very difficult. And we really socialize children to gender from very early ages. Just go into any Target and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. 6-month-old babies, the girl babies have the I'm a princess pink onesie, and the boys have an I'm a robot blue onesie. All right, so we start gender socialization very early. All right, so if we didn't do that, I bet we would have more gender diversity among the general population. People would feel freer to express themselves. So in a way, my theory, which is now coming out as scholarship, is that it's almost like, like I say here, we're accidental freedom. We're not as chained to all of that socialization because for us, we have to learn the social things so concretely. That's a possibility. So anyway, all right. So what I want to get into now is what's different. Like, okay, so we now know there's neurodivergent people who are also gender divergent. And why is this information important? Because I think that the neurodiversity can play into accessing care, some of those social things that I was just talking about. And here, I don't want to in this section, I don't want to over stereotype too much, but I think it's very important to think about the issues that can come up so that you can be a good ally if you're a parent, if you're a sibling, if you're a teacher, if you're in the mental health professional, if you're a healthcare worker. It's very important to think about this. So when you go in for gender related care, like I was saying before, it's regulated. There's rules like the WPATH, okay? And they're expecting to see certain things. All right, so this is in general what they're expecting to see. All right, I put it into like lay language, okay? But this is essentially it. They want to see you be able to articulate your gender identity verbally, to be able to say, I was assigned female at birth, but I feel like a man and I need to be a man. All right, they want to see that distress at not being a man, okay, not being seen as a man. They want to see conformity to gender notions, right? So if I'm walking in and I say I need to be a man, but I'm wearing red hot lipstick, the professionals are going to say, well, there's a question here, right? They're also looking at your socialize as preferred gender. So if I'm a man, I'm going to the football game, I want to call, I don't know, whatever it is that men do, right? And that you're very, very determined to be understood as your preferred gender. So you're doing the best that you can to get read as a man. All right. Okay. So here's the problem. Here comes a neurodivergent person who needs care and needs support, okay, needs education, needs community, and they walk in. So social, they're not always aware of those expectations for preferred gender, like I was just saying, right? I talk to many autistic teenagers and I'm like, okay, so what is a man in society? And I'm not saying they're very verbal. These are very articulate folks. They could be very articulate folks, but their answers will tend to be either all over the place or like hyper stereotyped. That's a very hard question for them to answer. Motivation. They may feel like they need to be a man, but they're not necessarily motivated to do all those social things that go into like the package of being a man. Sensory. I have a lot of transgender men who are neurodivergent who still prefer softer, more feminine clothes. It's a sensory preference. It doesn't mean that they aren't male, right? It's just, this is where the autism is showing up. Communication, they can't always articulate feelings. They may have trouble self-advocating, all right? I know in my own case, you can see I'm extremely articulate, but for many, many years when I was young, I could not really use language to explain my inner experiences. So nobody knew what was going on with me, right? I just seemed fine. Nobody knew that I was in so much pain. Executive functioning. So think about all the things like, okay, if you're a man and you shave, and if you're a woman and how you get dressed and all these things, that can be very complicated. A lot of autistic people just like roll out of bed and get the t-shirt and jeans on and call it a day because at least they're dressed, right? Routines, tolerance for disruption, literal thinking. They may also just not socialize in ways typical, like I know a lot of, autistic people who are, who are trans men, there's no way they're going to a He-Man football game. Like that's just not happening. But so professionals don't know what they're looking at, right? And it can be, autistic people routinely talk about how they get dismissed and they get, told that it's, this is not a real gender diversity. Okay. The other things that may go on that I think parents, especially, and professionals, especially, should be watching for, is sometimes it will seem as if the announcement that I'm gender diverse just comes completely out of the blue, right? When in reality, the autistic person has been thinking about it for years, but they haven't had the language to connect their feelings and what's going on for them psychologically. And then finally they can articulate it. But you think, well, this just came out of the blue and he wants hormones tomorrow. Like what's going on? Okay. I already said some of this when I was going over the previous slide. The person may still not wear, do, enjoy, or socialize in the, the way that society expects. They also may not get how society is reading them, and they may not care either. They may know, but they may not care. Okay, like I was saying, I know autistic people who are never going to hang out with the guys or chat with the girls. Like it's just not going to happen. So their gendered behavior doesn't seem to match that threshold for transition support. They may also resist traditional pathways to transitioning for a whole host of reasons. So what I mean by that is, some autistic people, for example, really identify as male and they want to live in society as men, but just the whole load to find a clinic, go down to a clinic, make an appointment, get yourself there, then get the medication filled, and then there's just so much, and so they may say, well, why do I need to do all of that just because society says I should? I'm just going to branch off and just be myself. Okay, so like I'm saying, neurodivergent people tend to be less likely to conform to society's expectations for their preferred gender. All right, and I love this quote from Dr. Strang, who I was talking about earlier. These individuals often push us to consider what gender truly is without this overlay of social expectations. All right. The other thing that I think neurodivergent people are really, really good at is pushing the gender binary, right? So there's male and female, but there's also, like I was saying earlier, non-binary, gender fluid. We also, in our society, like I said, it's hard to think about because we don't think about it consciously, but we really do have kind of narrow ideas about what a man is and what a woman is. We've been pushing it. We've been having cultural conversations, across my lifetime. The roles of women especially have morphed. More women work now. But we still have a lot of gender ideas. And like I said about Target, we have a lot of gender socialization. There's a lot of gender expectations. And so I think that what we're seeing with neurodivergent, gender divergent people is there's just like a wider bandwidth of human options. Okay. Um, what I want to put out there is that while I'm suggesting this is harmful to autistic people because they go to get care and they get denied, and we really want to put our minds on that, I think that this narrowness hurts everyone. So this was an actually peer-reviewed article. And the researcher said, my patient would ask how to act as a woman. And I would say that if he were essentially female, he would know how to act. He would despairingly plead for female hormones, but he did not share any interest in the arts of makeup or coiffure, or in finding high-heeled shoes that would fit. Not without grief, it dawned on him that he was not transsexual. When I read that, I thought I was reading something from the 1950s. That's 2014. I know plenty of women who are truck drivers, have never seen a stick of lipstick in their entire life, and they are undeniably women, and they have a right to be women, and they have a right to be understood as women. So I just feel so bad for this guy, and I this whoever this person was, I just misgendered them if they are female. So I apologize, but my point is, like, I think that the neurodivergent community through our self-advocacy is actually bringing this to attention in ways that are going to help more than just us. So I hope that that's also something that people will think about. So now we're at this big question. So how do we help? Some of the basic things that you can use is to use a preferred name or pronouns. It's really not too hard. I have the reference there that shows that it has an immediate and direct impact on people's mental health. So right off the bat, just make that effort and you're changing someone's life. And it's a low stakes. That's a low stakes social transition, because if they go by he and Andrew for a few weeks and it doesn't work, okay, we can go back to Andrea. Make an effort to understand people's experiences and viewpoints. Blame and shame, like over time when people change. You know, especially if we're talking about adolescents, they change a lot, even if they're not neurodivergent. I'm sure all of you can remember all the hairstyles you went through. Right. So we don't want to say, oh, see, I told you weren't really transgender. You know, they may need more time. You know, they may be discovering new things about themselves. And, you know, so you can see some variation over time, you know, trying different experiences, trying to see what's going to work. And we don't want to use that natural adolescent, young adult exploration against somebody. Okay. It doesn't mean that they were wrong. It doesn't mean that they lied to you. Okay. There's that stage of life. We expect a lot of changes in adolescence and young adulthood. Okay. Most people at 22 are like so embarrassed of themselves at 16. They're like, what was I thinking when I permed my hair? You know, it's natural. So you're going to see some change and some exploration. I really want to emphasize that even if let's say your child, your student comes to you and says, you know, I'm having some gender diversity and I'm trying to understand myself, plug them in immediately, even if you're like, no way, you know, they probably just read some newspaper article. Plug them in, because the rates of mental health problems, especially suicide, are much higher among gender diverse people. It's better to err on the side of caution. Let them talk to people, let them get help, let them go to the support group once or twice. If it's not the case, they'll know pretty quickly, right? You can't make somebody be something that they're not. People have tried that and it doesn't work. Human beings are pretty tenacious. Okay, when the person is also neurodivergent, you really want to factor in these communication, sensory, executive functioning, and other challenges without discounting the person or dismissing them or making them feel like, you know, they don't count enough. If that makes sense. What I mean by that is, you know, we see someone like Laverne Cox on television. I mean, she's gorgeous. and she passes, there's no one looks at her and says, that's not a woman. Okay, we call that passing privilege. Okay, most transgender people are not gonna pass so thoroughly, or not pass all the time, or not pass right away. Okay, it can take 5 or 6 years to really medically transition. Right. So, that's where we want to give that time and support, even if you're like, they say they're a man, but they don't look like a man at all. We have to factor this in. All right. Not everyone's gonna achieve Laverne Coxness. Okay. I think offering social skill support, guidance, information about men and women in society, that's fine, but to leave room for self-determination. Because just like I was just saying, you may want to clue them in, and we do this for each other anyway. We do this for adolescents, we do this for our children, even if neurodiversity, gender diversity is not on the table. Like I remember my mother explaining to my sisters, like women get dressed up and they do this and that, and if a man likes you, this is what happens, all that stuff that we explain to each other, right? But just keeping in mind, like I said, remember my truck driving example, right? There are plenty of women who wear overalls and, drive heavy equipment for a living. And so, just share, offer, help, but keep that wide open range of possibilities. Okay. And really help them advocate through systems of care, because it's very hard when you go and you're neurodivergent and gender diverse, and you're already plowing through all the communication, the executive functioning, the sensory, and then they're telling you, oh, well, no, it's just a special interest, or you're autistic. You couldn't tell what a man is in society anyway, so I'm not gonna help you. Like that you might be surprised, but that happens all the time. And what it boils down to, like I said here, just be on the person's team. And like I said, there may be changes, they may change their mind, there may be different decisions as you go through the process, but that doesn't mean they didn't mean it, right? They still need you, and they still need your help to get through this. When you're assessing people, I don't know how many people are in here professionals, but I know it's recording, and so some professionals may be looking at it. So like I said, when a person presents for gender affirming care in a system of healthcare, I mentioned some of the criteria that they're looking for: that articulation, the patterns of socialization, the motivation. And like I said, a neurodivergent person may not seem to meet those thresholds. Okay, so what happens is you have to reach those thresholds to get consent. So if you want to go on hormones, they're talking to you, they're looking at you, they're thinking about your life, and they're not going to write the letter for you to take to the doctor if you're not reaching that threshold. So what I want to put out for professionals, there are other ways to garner consent. Okay, it doesn't always have to be that verbal articulation. There are plenty of people with intellectual disability who are not going to sit down. And here I don't mean to be dismissive of anyone's intelligence at all. Okay, I know many in people with intellectual disability, some of whom are my incredible friends, and I have never, in all my years of doing this, no matter what the IQ says, I've never met a dumb human being. Okay, but there are human beings who are not going to sit down and have a half an hour theoretical conversation about gender constructs in society. Okay, that doesn't mean they don't need help for gender transition. Right. So one way is harm reduction. Okay, so you can approve them for gender affirming care if it's going to reduce harm. Okay, because like I said, people are smart. They're going to figure out what they need to do. All right, so we have people who, have been dismissed and people don't believe them. And so then they go and get hormones on the street. They don't know what dose they're taking. They don't know if the needles are clean. Okay, so by harm reduction, we can approve you for care. All right, so that's one way. Also, harm reduction, for example, if someone's suicidal and they're going to kill themselves because they can't get transgender care. Okay, well, I can reduce the harm by approving it, right? Behavior as communication. You can use people's behavior as communication. I gave an example of a case I did not work on, but there was a young gentleman with intellectual disability, and he was nonverbal, and he was in the female group home. And every morning he would wake up and he would go like this in the mirror, like as if he was shaving. And when the staff would try to get him to put on a bra, he'd have meltdowns. And let's say there was a boys group home across the street, and the vans would be outside, like maybe the girls are going to the mall or whatever, the boys are doing whatever. He was always trying to get on the boys' van, right? And luckily he had caring parents who sat down and tried to figure this out. And once he was, they approved him based on behaviors, okay? Because he was trying to tell you with his behavior that he didn't feel like a girl, and he felt like he was in the wrong place. And once he got gender affirming care and was placed in a different group home for men, all those meltdowns about the clothing went away. And suddenly he loved taking care of himself. He was just so many things in his life improved. So anyway, underscoring lack of verbal language, you can't use that as a barrier to treatment. Lack of cognitive skills can't be used as a barrier to treatment. And the autism related needs and differences that I spoke about a few minutes ago also can't be used as denial for care. So hopefully that can help professionals. Can you give me a time check as to where we are? Because I want to be conscious, but because the slides are up, I can't see the clock.
Yep, we're at 7:25, so you have plenty of time.
Okay, so I want to underscore the special mental health needs of neurodivergent, gender divergent individuals. There's a very high rate of suicidality for all transgender individuals. I mentioned that already. And then if you throw in the neurodivergent aspects, there can be, not always, but there can be greater struggles with these social complexities, the executive functioning. So that's why I say plug folks in right away, get them to people who can talk to them, see what's going on, get them the support that they need, whether that's just for social transitioning, whether it's just for exploration, whether it's for more education and more information, or whether they actually need to medically transition, right? I get this question asked by parents in particular, usually all the time, and there's not an easy way to answer the question of how fast is too fast when it comes to transitioning, because everybody is different. But what I say, which often surprises parents, I encourage people to take their time to really explore, to try different things, try different clothes, try different groups of friends, try different ways of being in the world, try going to the mall, see what happens, try different things and give yourself time, meet people, meet other gender divergent individuals, because here's what I find a lot now, is people think, okay, transition, I got to have all my surgeries and hormones. And then they meet gender divergent people and they're like, oh, wait, maybe I'm non-binary, and they may still need hormones and whatnot, but I mean, it's just opening up more options, right? So meet people, get plugged in, try things, give yourself a lot of time to explore, because you see, it's kind of normative for adolescents. They all think that, they got to do whatever it is right now. That's kind of normal. That's why hopefully they have adults in their life who say, let's think about this decision, before you buy that car, before you go out with that guy, let's have a conversation, right? We hope that they have adults with, we know now brains don't gel until you're like 25. The one caveat here, I want to be very, very careful. The exception is mental health. Okay, so if someone is at risk, if they're suicidal, if they're not able to function in life, all right, then they need help urgently. And that's when you turn to professionals. Like, don't try to navigate that by yourself. I see a hand up, so let me pause here. Yes.
Yeah. So I had a question. So I'm a pediatrician, and we've had some requirements about taking certain educational courses on gender identity. And I guess prior to those educational offerings, I kind of had this view of allowing youth to kind of discover, explore, and giving time. However, at many of them, the recommendation was to facilitate transitioning prior to puberty. And so it was a bit confusing. And it was the AAP recommendation because they felt as though if children and youth entered puberty and started to kind of develop, that would actually put them at a higher risk for more mental health. And so I just want to know if you kind of had any exposure to that train of thought.
Yes. I mean, where my limitation is that I can't speak to it medically, right? So I'm not exactly sure, for example, how hormones impact a 9-year-old body. What the issue is that people are tossing around is that, I say this very carefully. Generally speaking, people know if they're a boy or if they're a girl, and we don't want to be dismissive, and we are aware of the mental health risks. At the same time, what we're holding is that childhood, adolescence, those are periods of tremendous growth and tremendous change. And so, like I prefaced when I came to this slide, I don't have a hard and fast rule. All right. So I think it has to be very individual, and it has to be getting to know that if a child is coming to you and they have sought to live as a male since the age of 0, and it's crystal clear, and they can express it one way or another, either through behavior or language or social behavior. In that case, what I see a lot of, like, pediatric endocrinologists and other healthcare professionals do is they encourage all of the social transitioning. They can certainly wear male clothing, they can take a male name, they can hang out with the boys at school, and then do puberty blockers, which delays it a little bit, because then that gives the person a little bit more time, and then you can have conversations again once they get into adolescence. Now, you were talking about a case where, if they got hormones really young, you're right, then their bodies would start changing, and their bodies might start changing younger than their peers. And that can be very stressful. So as far as I know, I could be wrong, but this is where my limitation is. As far as I know, we're not giving sex hormones to young kids. We might give puberty blockers to give them until 16 or 17 when they can make more of a consent choice. In other words, what I'm seeing is there's less harm to delaying puberty than speeding it up.
Okay, so that was actually different. I think in these webinars, it was actually about facilitating the transition with hormones. So I felt a little uncomfortable with that, simply because of just what you mentioned, that oftentimes we see children and youth kind of go back and forth, and they need time to kind of make that decision. And as you said, if you get to adulthood, these are things that are hard to reverse. So yeah, I think it really does require a very individualized approach, because there's a lot of mixed messaging about, and it makes it complicated and challenging in terms of how to really help. But you do have to take a very unique approach to each person.
Yes. And I have been criticized too, because I think the barriers, like I spoke to, were so severe in the past, and that was very harmful. And we don't want to be too gatekeepy, certainly in adulthood. It's a very different conversation if you're making a 30-year-old wait.
Yes, and that.
But so I've been accused of, like, not listening to self-advocates and advocating more barriers. I'm not, but I'm saying, because I'm an expert in human development, and I've worked with these folks for over 20 years. I agree with you. Childhood and adolescence, not to be dismissive, people do know their identities, but they're still growing up. They're still trying things. They're still discovering who they are, whether they're neurodivergent, gender divergent, or anything else or not, right? So, you know, again, it's very individual, and I think we can take those mental health cases, certainly, that we, you know, there are cases where somebody knows, and if this doesn't come on board, they're going to be killing themselves, then yes, we have to come in, and they deserve that support as expediently as possible. I think our systems can handle that if we see that. But I think that it's also okay to help people socially transition and do everything socially. But, you know, with puberty blockers, for example, give them that a little more time, you know, to articulate what they're going to need, you know. And sometimes I'll even say it's nuanced. Okay. So for example, I'm dealing with a lot of transgender, transmasculine folks in the sort of 18 to 25-ish range. And they definitely identify as male, and they would love to go on hormones, and we shouldn't be dismissive of their needs or questioning their identity at all. But some of them are waiting because they also think they might want to have children. And we don't necessarily know how the testosterone is going to impact their reproductive organs. So we're helping them do everything possible to socially transition, but some of them are holding off on the hormones until they decide if they want to have a baby or not. So, you know, these are very important conversations to have with people, and it doesn't mean that we're being dismissive of somebody who knows who they are and what they need. You know, so I think we have to hold both things at one time. Yes, give the care when it's absolutely clear and needed, and it's going to save the person's life. There should be no barriers there whatsoever. Also, we need to get ourselves okay with allowing children to experiment and socially transition. There's absolutely no harm with a 9-year-old dressing like a boy, choosing a boy's name, using he, him. You know, that's fine. You know, and that may save him mentally. So there's no reason why we can't do that as a society, to be tolerant and understanding and respectful. You know, it's hard for me to speak to it medically. I do know a pediatric endocrinologist here in Maryland who's done research and speaks about this. And I know that she encourages the using those puberty blockers to give a little more time. You know, because again, you know, delaying development a little bit is usually not a standout stressful thing for an adolescent, because they are all over the, you know, all adolescents, you know, some have, you know, fully developed breasts by the time they're 13, others not until they're 18. You know, some young men start getting facial hair at 12, some have no facial hair whatsoever throughout college, you know, so it's not as big of a deal to like delay it, I would think, from a non-medical viewpoint.
Well, I think I like that approach too, that you're coming up with, because I just feel, just because of how, you know, minds change, I personally, I felt a bit uncomfortable with the kind of forcing hormonal transitioning on a younger person. You know, I think once you get to the age of majority 18, you of course you could do whatever you want to do, unless of course, like you said, there's this mental health risk. But I just wanted to hear from your perspective.
Yeah, I would even say, I might even phrase it, not so much that minds change, but needs can change, issues can change, right? Like a 9-year-old is not thinking, do I want to be pregnant one day?
Yeah, that's true.
It's the 20-year-old is, right? So they are still identifying as a boy. They didn't change their mind, but now the needs, the conversations are going to be different, right? So just giving that time, if possible, like I said, again, underscoring mental health risk, that's a different conversation. And we don't want to leave those people in a situation that where they're you know, going to harm themselves or kill themselves, because that, unfortunately, we have high rates of that. We want to be vigilant. We want to be vigilant to that. All right. So we've asked teenagers who are neurodivergent and gender divergent what would help them. That emotional support, because the inner experiences can be confusing, and they may not have ways to explain themselves. role models. They need to see gender divergent people so they can understand, what does this look like? How do gender divergent people have a life? How do they make those choices? How do they navigate at different ages, right? Peer group. They desperately want to belong to other people who get this, who are also questioning. Exploration and expression opportunities, even those with more significant issues. So I know that can be very uncomfortable for some parents who are working with someone who maybe has more cognitive impairment, more linguistic impairment, and they want to wear lipstick or something, but they have the same right to that human need to explore who they are. The executive functioning, I mentioned that, the social skills, I mentioned that. And they all interestingly said that they want their parents to have support, just not in the same room with them. So they really want to feel like they have their own space to explore, and they recognize that parents need help too and need support too, but they want the parents to go to like parent spaces. So that's what they're telling us in the research. Siblings. Okay, there's some research on siblings of autistic children. There's almost no research on siblings of transgender children. That's not to say that there isn't any, but I do scholarship all the time and I haven't found any. If you know of any, send them my way. What we can pull is just from general sibling research, explaining what's going on with their sibling, explaining what that dysphoria is, that they just feel so uncomfortable in their body. They just know that they're not a girl. So we're going to let them wear pants and cut their hair and call themselves Jim. And so they understand that it's not that the kid is being weirdo or just asking for attention or whatever. It's a real need that they have. Explaining to the siblings the vulnerability and the marginalization. And that's why it's so important to be supportive, even if we're uncomfortable, even if we get teased sometimes. You know, it's really important to show up for our gender divergent, neurodivergent loved ones. I think that you can get creative there, though. I mean, it doesn't mean they have to go to the Pride March with their sibling if they're not comfortable doing that. But, you know, having those conversations, you know, using their pronouns. What is it going to be like at school? You know, like having those conversations and figuring out where the sibling can be comfortable, where the fit sibling is feeling not comfortable yet, and where the sibling has like a hard boundary. And figuring out how in this group, in this family, how we're going to navigate all of this, which families are doing anyway, really, right? So this is just adding to the work of being together that families are already doing. I think meeting siblings, you know, again, I don't know exactly how you could logistically find siblings that specifically have autistic transgender siblings, but there are, like, for example, sibling support groups for autism or intellectual disability, often at organizations like the ARC, hospitals, internets. There's even camps now for like siblings of transgender kids, and then there's camps for siblings of autistic kids. I haven't seen the two cross yet, but those may be useful resources for you. I think that it's also important because we're pouring all this support on the child who's neurodivergent and gender divergent because there's such a vulnerability there. But let's not forget, also, let's go to the, you know, the non-autistic, non-gender divergent kids basketball game, and let's meet their friends and let's support them and show that, you know, really human beings, that's the work that we do, is we support each other, right? So we want to make sure that that's very explicit so nobody feels like they're being left out or somebody else gets all the attention. And that's generally, this is what I said, this is coming out of general sibling research. Team approach, you know, so use that team language, like we're in this together as a family and this is hard right now, and we're going to go talk to somebody who's going to help us understand, you know, we're going to get through this. Just keeping up that feeling of togetherness, because it can easily feel like, you know, I'm stuck in this house with all of you, you know. It's like, let's do this together, you know, and just to make it like we're going to get through this together. I think that that's the best approach. I thought I saw someone's hands up, and I see some a number in the chat. Are there questions or comments in the chat area?
I have not seen anything in the chat.
Okay. Maybe I have to pull it up. Okay, no, that's all right. That was just letting people know they can use the chat if they do have questions. Okay. See if I can go backwards. Okay. So I put together some local resources. I mentioned Dr. Strang at Children's National. We're very lucky because we have a lot of support options in this particular area. Chase Brexton has various locations, Baltimore Metro, but they also have Columbia, and I think Columbia is as close as they get to the DC area. But they have many locations, and they have counseling, they have support groups even for teenagers, and they can help with medical transition. And Dr. Elise Pine is an endocrinologist who is an expert in dealing with gender divergent children, and that's who I was kind of quoting earlier. So I encourage you, if you're in the healthcare field, talk to her, call her up, look at her work, go hear her talk. She's got excellent information, and she can also help families. You know, she's actively seeing clients. So she's a great resource in our area. In DC Metro, there's Whitman Walker. That's like a clinic for LGBTQ people, and they also have like a range of services. Nationally, I put together some resources. Again, I don't have a resource for you that is autistic and transgender merged, right? But you can go to each of these places and get, you know, different support for different facets of what's going on. There's the Trans Lifeline and the Trevor Project. Those are really good if someone is having a mental health crisis. You know, they can steer you to options really quickly. The Autism Asperger Network is up in New England, but they have online support groups for gender divergent autistic people. So that is one place where there is a little bit more of a merge. And they also have one for parents. PFLAG, they're all over the country. They are also really good if you're having trouble at school. Okay, and you want to know what your kids' rights are regarding the bathroom, etc. Like PFLAG is going to know that because they're in the different counties all over the place. There's also the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. So that's another one. Like if your child wants to change their name legally, you know, what's the laws going on in your state regarding medical care? Now we're getting a lot of pushback, and there are problems in some states. So definitely check out these resources to make sure you understand, like, you know, what the laws are in your area. Okay. On social media, there are resources, and some people say to me, well, give me an exact group. I don't like doing that because I really feel like people have to vet it for yourself because everyone has different needs. But there's a lot of groups on Facebook. There's an autistic and trans group. There's MTF and FTM groups that are very affirming of neurodivergent people and disabled people. The Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network, they've got a website with blogs and news and webinars. And so they do a lot around autism and gender diversity. There's social media accounts of self-advocates. Like I said, find them, find these role models, find out what their experiences are, even if it's virtual, because that's going to help you. It's going to help the person you're supporting. 18 plus, because I actually get this question from people, you know, what about dating? There is an app that's specifically for LGBTQ folks that is very neurodivergent friendly compared to some of the other apps. So if you were to go on there and say I'm autistic and transgender, like no one's going to bat an eye. But that's 18 plus. Okay, so role models, because people ask me about that. So I put up a few here. Marcy Bowers is a transgender doctor in Pennsylvania, so not too far. And she does transgender surgeries. So she's a wonderful role model. She also goes to Africa and does free surgeries for female people who've had genital surgeries, often against their will, and helps repair some of the problems and does a lot of advocacy around that. So she's an amazing advocate also. So there's an article here in Medium, and it has all the great, wonderful transgender self-advocates out there that we love, like Chaz Bono and Laverne Cox, who I mentioned earlier. So, you know, luckily today, your children who are growing up today have so much more visibility and possibility for affirmation and support than we did. So that's the good news. and it's not even bad news. The only issue now is we're wrestling with those questions like that were asked earlier, like what time, what age, how long do we, do we make people wait, and if so, how long, and all those questions. But at least the care systems are there, the community is there. Unfortunately, we're getting a lot of cultural attack. That's sort of the push-pull. I'm optimistic that things will get better, but they may have to get worse first. That's a whole nother discussion. I would like to just end on a positive note, which is like what I was just saying. I think the world, at least in some ways or in some areas, is getting more open-minded, more willing to make room for diverse human beings in our society. And we're really realizing that diversity is our greatest strength.